Record. I'm going to hide the video panel, so if you are showing yourself and trying to flag me down, I won't be able to see you, so just pop something into the chat if you have some questions. So, awesome. Excellent. Okay, so what I wanted to cover for this particular study group is promises in JavaScript, how they work, kind of dive a little deep into how to create a promise, and then, the kind of the problems that they solve. So, and then if you guys have any questions, I'll feel free to ask them as I go along. So, and also feel free to interrupt me if you do have questions. So first I want to go to the MDN docs that cover the promises or how promises work. So a promise is an object that represents the eventual completion of an asynchronous operation and its resulting value. So what that means is at some point, if we get back a promise, we know that at some point we're going to get back some kind of value, either the resolved value if the logic inside that function is sound and it wants to return that, or some kind of error message if that promise is rejected. So that's essentially what a promise is. It's a guarantee for some sort of value down the line at some point. So we can see here, this is how you create a promise using the promise constructor function. So new promise, and then that takes in a callback function with a resolve and reject object. And we'll talk about this in more detail in a little bit. So this is just a high-level overview of what a promise is, and the MDN docs do a good job of explaining it, what the parameters are, and how they work in general. So just wanted to point that out before we actually dive in. But first I want to talk about, the problem they help solve. So, before promises came into play, and that was with, ES6 or ES 2015, the only other way to handle asynchronous operations is via a callback. And, you've heard the term callback hell, and, that's sort of a buzzword when you read about promises, but there is a thing too, callback hell, where you can have this nested Christmas tree of callback functions. So promises allow us to write code that looks a little more synchronous in nature, even though it's asynchronous. So what do I mean by synchronous? Does anyone want to either unmute or in the chat kind of clarify what we mean by synchronous? No one else? Cool, no problem. So synchronous code runs before any other code that follows it. So, if you have 10 lines of code, each line of code is going to run before the next one can run and complete. So that's what we mean by synchronous. But JavaScript is non-blocking or asynchronous, which means that you can run other bits of code even though you skip, a certain line above it. So let's take a look at how that works in practice. So I have this file here, text.txt. I'm going to create another file, read file .js, and actually we'll make this read file sync.js. And inside that particular file, I'm going to want to do a couple of things. I'm going to want to pull in the file system. So var, actually let's do file name, and let's make that equal to text.txt, which is this file that we have down here. And we also want to create a variable for the file service, which is a node file service. So we're going to require that. Require fs. This is Node doesn't support ES6 import, so that's why we have to do it this way. So we're requiring the file system, and then we're going to do console.log reading file, and then we're going to invoke that file, but or that file system by calling fs.read file sync. This is a method on the file system that allows us to read a file synchronously. We're going to use template string so we can interpolate a couple of things. First thing we want to interpolate is the directory name. That's represented by 2 underscores and then dir name, followed by the path to our file. File name. Cool. This is going to read the file right here. Then we're going to say console.log, done reading file, and then console.log, contents, file, and we got to call it .toString, because the way that the file is returned to us, or the way that the read file sync returns our result, we need to convert that to an actual string. Cool. I think that's everything. I'm going to run node readFileSync.js, and we can see here synchronously reading file, done reading file, and then the contents. So each of these lines of code was executed, completed before the next one can run. So that's synchronous. Any questions regarding that? Pretty straightforward. Now I'm going to do read file async. And I'm going to copy a lot of what we have here. One thing we're going to do now is read file async. I think read file async takes in 2 arguments. First one is the path of the file we want to read. And then the second one is a callback function. So again, before, that's how we would handle asynchronous operations, is with this callback function. I think that callback function takes in an argument. Cool. And inside that callback, we're going to do console.log done reading file. And actually, a lot of this we can move up. I'm going to get rid of this. I'm going to move this up. And then that looks good. And then down here, there. Actually, I'm going to change the name of this. File response. File response. Then down here, I'm going to do console.log not done reading contents of file still, and then we're going to log the value of file here. So again, it's pretty much the same as the read file sync, but now we're doing read file async because it's an asynchronous operation, so that it'll allow us to skip this bit of code until it's done reading the file and go straight to line 11. So we should see reading file, not done reading content of the file yet, still, and then this should be, what do you think this value is going to be when it logs to the console? Anyone have any guesses to what the value of file is going to be?
Just what's inside your function.
Oh, say that again, I'm sorry.
What's inside your function, the done reading file, maybe?
Right here?
Yeah.
So we're gonna, so let's take a look. So the way this is gonna work, because read file async is asynchronous, it's gonna do this bit and not do this until the file is done reading. So it's immediately gonna skip this code and go here to line 12. And so we're gonna see reading file, then we're gonna see not done reading contents of the file yet, still, and then we're gonna log the actual value of this, which should be undefined, because we haven't finished doing what we wanted to do up here. So read file async, yep, Nope. I did not mean to do that. I meant to do node read file async. Okay. Read file async is not a function. Am I doing it wrong? Node read file async. I need to change. I just downloaded the new Firefox Developer Edition, and I need to change the default search. Here are the different methods on the file system. One. Interesting. Do not tell me they took away async. Interesting. Node read a file async. Bring this back to the file system. Maybe it's just read file. Yeah, okay. They must have changed the API. Cool, no worries. So this is now just read file. There we go. There we go. Reading file, not done reading contents of the file yet. Still undefined. Then, once we're done reading the file, this callback function kicks off, where we enter this callback function. We can see we console.log a bunch of the equal signs just to have a little border. Then we say done reading the file. And I don't think we need to call toString. I think that actually parses the response, so we don't need to call .toString. Contents are null. Okay. Interesting. File async file. Oh, you know what? I think the first argument to that is error. So if there's an error, yeah, and then the next is the response. There we go. So we can do something like if no error, do that. Cool. Okay. Awesome. Any questions with what we've done so far? Haven't really dove into the promises yet, but wanted to kind of just illustrate first the problem. So even there, so let's say that now we've gotten, we've read the initial file, but now let's say we wanted to take that initial file content and merge it with another file. So then what we would need to do inside this callback function is we would need to call fs.readFile again, pass in the path to another file, there, and then that takes an anonymous function. File, what did I do? File response 2. If I move this down to kind of keep in line with everything else, there's that. Move this in a little bit. And then we would, concatenate file response plus, whatever. I wanted to merge those two responses together or something like that. So, and then let's say, again, I wanted to take this resulting response and then read a third file. So you can kind of see how we'll have these nested callback functions, all nested within each other, which can get pretty messy. So that's where promises come in. Any questions with regards to that issue that I just illustrated, or the problems with that, with this nested callbacks? Cool. So yeah, promises give us a way to handle asynchronous processing in a synchronous fashion. It's all still asynchronous, but it looks, by reading how they get handled, it reads a lot better than the nested callbacks. And the API is pretty simple, but it does come with a little bit of a learning curve. So let's build out a basic promise. Let's create a new file. Basic promise.js. Cool. And then if we go back to the API, here we go. So a promise is created with the promise constructor. And they give us an example, I believe, down here. Here you go. So new promise, and then that promise takes in an anonymous function with resolve and reject as its arguments. So let's actually just copy this entire bit. We'll delete some of this stuff. Here we go. Excellent. And then we can save that in a variable. We'll call it new p. It's equal to new promise, and it takes in a resolve and reject. And we can resolve the value and invoke that resolve method with the value we want the promise to return. So if I take this new p, the way you handle a promise is with a .then call. Now that .then takes in an anonymous function where the argument is the value that the promise resolves with. So I'm going to console.log. Sorry. Cool. So new p is a promise. And any promise we handle with a .then. And what we can do with inside that .then, there's an anonymous function that receives the value that gets resolved by that promise. So when I console.log here in line 7, this value is going to be the string hello. So let's run this. Node, basic promise. So we can see hello is logged to the console. That's if we resolve. If we reject, which is the second argument to the promise constructor, then this throws an error where we can catch that error. Oops. Function catch also takes in an anonymous function with the error that we pass to it. And we can console.log error. And actually, I'm going to change this just so we know. Now we're rejecting, so we're hitting the catch. And just so you know, resolved value is that, and error is that. Cool. So if we do that, so error is error, and then if we resolve, and we see yes. And then now we can start to build logic inside this promise to where we can say var 10 or var num equals 10. If num is less than 20, resolve the number is less than 20, else we want to reject. The number is greater than 20. Cool. So now we have this logic inside this promise, and we're either going to resolve or reject based off of what this number is. And because num is 10, we're going to resolve. I'm going to change num to 30. Now we see the number is greater than 20. It's an error. So that's, again, high level how we can build out a promise to either resolve or reject based off of certain criteria and certain logic that we want to define. Any questions regarding that? Cool. Excellent. So now let's go to the issue of the whole read file where we use the promise. So let me create a new file, read file promise.js. Okay, I'm going to take, for now, I'm just going to copy everything from read file async, paste it here. I'm going to change a couple things here. I think we want to stay reading file now instead of this guy. I'll comment this out for now. I'm going to say const file promise is equal to new promise. That takes in resolve reject. Inside the new promise, we are going to use the file system to read the file. We're going to pass in the directory. fs.read file. File name. Cool. Oh. Here we go. Excellent. Just make sure my syntax isn't off. Yeah. Second argument is the function error. And then the contents. Excellent. If error, we're going to reject with the error. Yeah, actually, this needs to move out of here. Sorry. Else, we want to resolve with the contents. Excellent. Cool. So this promise, this file promise is equal to a new promise where we're going to read the file system. We're going to check and see that we have our contents that we want. If so, then, or if we don't have our contents and we get an error, we're going to reject with that error. Else, we're going to resolve with the contents. Cool. So then what I can do down here is I can take that file promise. I can tack on a .then. And that .then can take in a function with its argument of contents. I can console.log the contents. Otherwise, I can catch in console.log the error. Cool. Excellent. So this file promise will live somewhere else, in your code. And then this right here you're going to take that file promise and then handle the either resolution of it or the rejection of it, depending on if it's resolved or rejected. What did I call this? Read file promise. Cool. Excellent. And you know what? Resolve contents to string again. There you go. File contents. Cool. But now we can kind of see here, and actually I'd probably abstract this out into a separate method, this read file into a separate method, so then we can call multiple times this method and then just tack on the dot then. So as we get, as we get more files, because again, that idea of wanting to concatenate more the contents one on top of the other, this would be how we would do it. Enable us to be able to, actually, let's do that real quick. So, hang on. Const get file is equal to a path. Return new promise. And I can probably take this entire guy. Cool. And then this will just be the path. Cool. Then we can say get file, pass in some kind of random path. Then get file returns a promise. So we would handle it with dot then. Where we'll get our contents. Then inside here, we're going to call get file again. Return get file. Pass in random path 2. And then whenever you return inside a dot then, that returns another promise. That's why you can handle that with another dot then. Now you have your contents that you're passing. We might want get file to also return, the values that they return. So, or actually accept additional contents. Path content to add. Excellent. And then you're going to resolve contents to string plus content. Now we're concatenating the content to add, and we'll initialize this to an empty string so that the first time we call get file, we're not passing in we don't have any content yet. So we're going to initialize that to or default it to an empty string so that if we don't pass it in as a second argument, then it just gets, an empty string gets concatenated on the first go round. But then any other second go round, then that content gets added to the new content, and then we can continue to chain on a bunch of so this would be how, and then this, again, instead of having a bunch of nested callbacks, in that callback hell that you normally see, we're just tacking on dot thens, dot thens, dot thens. And this looks a lot more synchronous. And it reads a lot more synchronous than that whole nested callback. Any questions there? Cool. Feel free to pop something in the chat because, again, I can't see your guys' screens. So, oh, I do see a chat function is up anyway. Cool. Hey, John, sorry, I just, my thing chat wasn't flashing, so I didn't notice you asked that question a few minutes ago. Which function are you asking about? Oh, okay. Is it clear now, or let me know if you still need me to, okay, of return async? Gotcha. Yeah, if we go back to here, this is how we were handling, again, the asynchronous. So in a way, we're still using this read file. We're still using callbacks, but now we're kind of abstracting that out to where we don't have a bunch of nested callbacks, and we just have this one callback that we're reusing and only have to define once. Because in the rest of the handling of the issues, we can just use with promises. And the way you handle promises with the dot thens. So this is similar to how we were doing this. So we're doing read file, read file, read file there. We get file response and file response 2, and we want to do another read file that takes in another path. Just assume these paths are different. And that takes in a function where we get response 3. And then in there, we would concatenate, file response plus file response 2 plus file response 3. So then you have this nested callback issue, whereas in the promise one, we just define that nested callback once, or that callback once, and then every time we call get file, we're returning a new promise that either rejects or resolves. And every time we resolve, we tack on the new content to add to the contents that we just read from the file so that it's nice and clean. Excuse me. Cool. So the main takeaways are how to handle a promise. If you know what you're getting back is a promise, just know that you handle it using .then. And .then takes in an anonymous callback function with the value that the promise resolves with, if it is resolved. A lot of the times you don't see the actual promise that's handling the data when you make a call to an API. You just know that you're getting back a promise, and it's either going to have a resolved value or a rejected value. That's why you have a .then, and then you have a .catch in the event that the promise rejects for some reason, for whatever reason. Rarely are you implementing your own promises, but there are some APIs that don't utilize a promise spec, where this is where you can take advantage of that and wrap those API calls around a promise. Questions? Cool. Couple more things I just want to show utilizing the promise spec. First is, again, I want to show you the issue of a nested callback. It's going to take in a number and a callback. Const result is equal to a times 2. Just to simulate time, an API call, we're going to call a set timeout. We're going to wait for 1500 milliseconds, and then we are going to execute the callback with the result. So this is an API, it's called API double function that takes in one argument and a callback. We're going to set a result variable equal to that argument times 2. Then we're going to wait 1.5 seconds and then execute that callback. This is simulating an API call. So to invoke that, we're going to call the function. We're going to pass in the first argument, which is 5. This is going to be the A. And then the second argument is going to be the callback itself, callback function, which is going to give us our result. And we are going to console.log those results. Cool. So here we're going to do node. I put this in the basic promise. So there's our 15 seconds. We get back 10 because API double takes in that 5, multiplies it by 2, and then we invoke the callback that console.logs the results. So if we wanted to continue to take that result and double that result a couple of times, then we would need to call API double again, pass in results, results 2, and then API double again, pass in results 2, and then we have results 3. And now we can console.log results 3. So we're waiting, 1.5 seconds 3 times because we're calling API double 3 times. And now we can see 40 is logged, which makes sense because 5 doubled, that's 10. 10 doubled is 20. And then 20 doubled is 40. So that's why we see 40 logged to the console. So again, this is using callbacks and using that issue with callback hell. But how can we convert this to utilize the promise spec? Anyone want to help me out with that? So now instead of API double taking in 2 arguments, we're just going to have it take 1 argument. And we're going to have that return a new promise that takes in resolve and reject as its arguments. We want to call set timeout again, just again to simulate an API call. Cool, and we're going to resolve with the result. Cool. So we're resolving with result. API double is still a function, but now it returns a promise. So in order to handle that promise, first thing I'm going to do is, okay, I'm going to call API double, pass in 5. So now I get back a promise. I know I'm getting back a promise because that's what I'm returning. How can I handle that promise here? Do dot then. Cool, so now we get our result for the first one. And we're going to return API double, pass in result. So that's going to take care of passing in the result from the first API double call into API double again. And whenever I return inside a dot then, I get back another promise. And that's a good thing about these dot thens. They're scoped. So I can use this result more than once. I'm going to return API double result again. And then finally, I'll have my results, which I can log to the console. Cool. And we still get back 40. And we don't have those nested callbacks. And it looks very synchronous in terms of how it looks. You know, it reads very synchronously. Then. And then, yeah, we could add a catch if we wanted to, but we're never, right now we're not rejecting inside the promise, so we're never going to hit the catch. And what we can do is we can turn these into arrow functions, so we don't have to use the function keyword. So we can do that and that, get rid of the curly braces, get rid of the return keyword, because if we have an arrow function that doesn't have curly braces, then we by default return the next operation after the arrow. So this is automatically getting returned or implicitly getting returned. Also, because we have one argument to the arrow function, we don't need the surrounding parentheses. So we can do that. And then the final thing, same thing with this. And then console.log that result. Cool. Yeah. And then that still all does the same thing. Cool. All right. Questions? Cool. Now, just I'll do a quick practical standpoint. You know, how would I actually use this? Let's say that you had a service. Let's see. I'm going to create a file here. API service JS, and let's define that. We use an ES6 class for that as a get data method that takes in an endpoint you need to make a call to, and inside that this method of get data, we're going to return a new promise, and that particular promise again takes in resolve or reject. Cool. And we are going to make a fetch request to that endpoint. Fetch itself returns a promise. So we need to take the response of that fetch request, parse out the JSON I'm sure you guys, if you haven't yet come across that fetch material, you will get there. Then we can finally get the data that we want, where we can resolve the data. Cool. So this promise is going to be resolving the data that we get back from this fetch request. And what we can do here to handle that particular service is create a method. What's a good way to do this? I guess we can have another method called load data. And it's going to take an endpoint where we can call on the API service, call the method getData, pass in the endpoint. So this call right here, we know we're getting back a promise because that method returns a promise. So we can tack on the .then, where we get the data, where we console.log data. Cool. One thing I do need to do is pull in node fetch. So I need a package.json where we can yarn add node fetch, because fetch is native to the browser. And if we want it server side, we need to pull in a node package for that. So up here, var fetch is equal to require node fetch. Then it'll allow us to make this fetch call without any errors. Cool. So now we have this function called load data, which calls on our API service, passes the endpoint. Now we need to actually invoke this method, load data. We need to pass in an endpoint. I think what we can do, GitHub API is public. Let me just double check here. API.github.com. Trying to remember. I think it's /users. And then username. Yeah, cool. So I'm gonna grab that guy and pop that into here. Cool. So I'm calling load data, passing in this endpoint. Load data is calling an API service, passing on that endpoint. That method returns a promise where we resolve the data from that fetch request to that GitHub API endpoint, where we then log to the console. Let's all cross our fingers, make sure this works as I run node basic promise. Oh, you know what? I'm calling the wrong one. I need to call node API service. There we go. Okay. Oh, this needs to be either a function or function keyword or an arrow function. I'm going to make it an arrow function. Get data. Okay. I wonder if we need to create a new API service. Const service equals new API. And then just call service.getData. Oops. There we go. I just needed to invoke a new API service because this is similar to a constructor function where we need to create a new object. Then we have access to call. GetData is kind of like an instance method. I don't want to use the word instance method because it's not object-oriented programming. So cool. But now we were able to log that data from calling the GitHub API endpoint. for my public GitHub profile. Awesome. Questions? This is a lot, so I apologize if I've been rambling here. Async await. Excellent question. So async await is something new that was released with Node 7, I believe. And it's another way to handle asynchronous operations in a very synchronous looking way. So I'm developing a study group on async await. So hopefully I can get that up in the next couple of weeks. So it's been a pretty busy last couple of weeks, so haven't had time to flesh out that study group just yet. But but I do hope to post a study group for that in the next couple of weeks, John. So keep a lookout for that. But yeah, it's another API that was just released recently with Node 7 that allows us to do the same sort of asynchronous functionality, but make it look very synchronous. Good question. Cool. Yeah, and I did record this, so I'll make sure I post this up to the dashboard later on today. If there are no other questions, I will leave you all to enjoy your Thursday evenings. Have a good rest of the night. Take care, guys.